5, Activity 1. In this activity, we will explore Muslims, mosques, and America, particularly after the terrorist attacks of September 11th, 2001. We will begin by taking a look at some basic demographics of Muslims in the United States, mosques in the United States, going back over their pattern of development, trends, and geographic distribution. And then we're going to fit immigration from majority Muslim countries into the longer history of not only immigration in America, but also movements in American history that have been decidedly nativist and xenophobic. With that context in mind, we will then want to take a look at how Muslims and mosques have become the targets of more recent nativist, xenophobic, and Islamophobic movements in the United States. We'll focus in on several incidences of controversy or protests, sometimes armed protests, at mosques by Americans who fear the erosion of their dominant position in American culture in the face of changing demographics, and the way that those fears manifest across the country from the bluest of states like New York to some of the reddest of states like Tennessee. If you were to ask most Americans, what is the Muslim world? Many respondents would tell you the Middle East. They might point to North Africa, and some might point to Pakistan or Afghanistan. But the Muslim world is coterminous with the globe. For instance, the country with the largest Muslim population per capita in the world is not even in the Middle East. It's Indonesia in Southeast Asia. And Muslims have represented a significant minority in countries in Africa, Asia, Europe, and growing numbers of minority religious populations in North and South America. In what is now the United States, Muslims were present in the colonial period. Muslims were caught up in the transatlantic slave trade. We have biographies and autobiographies of Muslims brought to North America as slaves, and we have archaeological evidence of burials in African and African American cemeteries where the remains are, in proper Muslim tradition, buried facing Mecca. As of the 2010 census, there were 2.6 million self-identifying Muslims in America. According to a 2007 study by the Pew Research Center, of those 2.6 million Muslims in America, 65% could trace their ancestry to Muslim immigrants. However, almost a quarter of Muslims are African Americans. African American interest in Islam became strong in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The founding of groups like the Moorish Science Temple and the Nation of Islam, out of an interest in recovering African heritage and African traditions, and a notion that many Africans and African Americans caught up in slavery were stripped of their African heritage and their African faiths, and taught the Christianity of white slaveholders. And therefore, a rejection of that white slaveholding Christianity should be made by returning to African roots and African traditions, among which Islam was a significant tradition. Beyond that, around 4 to 5% of Muslims in the United States are Caucasian, almost all of whom are converts to Islam. About 3% Latino, and 3% Asian, Native American, Pacific Islander. As in the rest of the world, a majority of Muslims in America are Sunni, and about 20% to 25% are Shiites. To explain that, we'd have to go back into Muslim history within a few decades of the death of the Prophet Muhammad, during the time of the rightly guided caliphs, and Islam's first schism or theological divide over who should be the caliph after the death of the fourth rightly guided caliph, Ali. Most Muslims sided with a Syrian governor named Muawiyah. However, a minority faction of Muslims believed that Ali's sons, either his eldest son Hassan or his youngest son Hussein, should be the rightly guided caliph, the successor to Ali, because in Arab tradition, when a chieftain died, his successor should be his nearest male relative. Hussein ultimately assumed the mantle of the correct or true caliph, marched towards Baghdad to claim his caliphate, was ambushed by forces loyal to that Syrian governor Muawiyah, and killed. The Muslims who followed Hussein and believed that this was an unjust massacre identified themselves as the party of Ali, the Shi'at Ali, the Shiites. Shiites are a majority of Muslims in countries like Iran and Iraq, the island nation of Bahrain, and significant minority populations in eastern Saudi Arabia, Lebanon, and Syria. Of note, the United States has one of the largest proportions of Shiite Muslims of any country in the West, outside of those countries with sizable Shiite minority populations I just mentioned. The reason for this: preferential immigration status that we gave to Iranian dissidents following the toppling of the Shah of Iran and the installation of the current Islamic Republic. Among the other Muslims in the United States, there's a number of Muslims that have been understudied, under-researched. They are who we would call cultural Muslims, nominal Muslims, Eid-only Muslims. They may not even necessarily believe in God. They may be agnostic. There are a growing number of Muslims in the United States, particularly among those third or fourth generation immigrant descended Muslims, who value the arts and culture of Islam, who value the cultural heritage of their ancestral Middle Eastern, North African, Southeast Asian, South Asian country, but whose affiliation beyond familial ties and cultural longing is not running with deep theological roots. Nevertheless, with Muslims accounting for only 2.6 million Americans, and with 65% of that relatively small Muslim population in the United States tracing their heritage to immigrant families, many Americans, particularly Americans who do not personally know even a single Muslim, look at Islam and see Islam as a foreign faith, as not something that's truly American. And this is an issue that will play out for us in this presentation. In 19th and 20th centuries, American population growth and arguably economic growth were both sustained by immigration and immigrant labor. America has never been at ease with foreignness, or those deemed foreign, or ideas deemed foreign, or religious faiths deemed foreign. Through the 18th century, the 1700s, and the first decades of the 19th century, immigration was relatively low. That began to change by the 1840s and 1850s. Particularly European immigration from Ireland, beset by a potato famine, and from what is now Germany, facing political upheaval. In the 1840s and early 1850s, hundreds of thousands of Irish and German immigrants streamed into North America, to the United States, to ports at Boston and New York, and then from those locations moved ever westwards to Chicago and the upper Midwest. Within a decade, American nativist movements coalesced into what was called the American Party, or derisively called the Know-Nothings. Riots, literature attacking the Irish, and spikes in anti-Catholic rhetoric significantly increased during the 1840s and 1850s. For instance, on the right is a depiction of a riot in Philadelphia in 1844 when Catholics, to request that public schools had long used the King James Bible in their classrooms, allow Catholic students to use Douay Rheims. And this nativist sentiment was not only directed against European immigrants, but on the West Coast, significant numbers of Chinese and Japanese immigrants had come to find work on railroads, as well as the late 1840s gold rush in California. By 1882, Congress passed the Chinese Exclusion Act, essentially banning immigration from China. By the 19-teens and the 1920s, with American Protestants worried about increasing secularization, the challenge of science, and higher biblical criticism, the outbreak of the First World War only furthered their suspicions about foreign ideas and subversive elements like Catholics and Jews. Not to mention, by the end of the 19-teens, the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. Putting all of this together, white American Protestants reacted to these threats. White Americans revitalized Nathan Bedford Forrest's old white terrorist group, the Ku Klux Klan. And the Ku Klux Klan by the 1920s and 30s was flourishing in places like Indiana, New York, and the New Jersey Shore. Alongside the Klan rallies, many of the same participants, but not all, took part in gatherings that were called 100% American rallies. America First. One God, one country, one flag. Struggling to make America great in the face of Jews and Catholics and immigrants. It was not until the late 1940s, following the Second World War and the start of the Cold War against the communist Soviet bloc, that Americans, particularly white American Protestants, began reconceptualizing who was American and what faiths were American. By the 1950s, this unified front of patriotism, white nationalism, and anti-communism began to percolate ideas of America as a melting pot. The notion that when you came to America, all your foreignness and distinctiveness kind of washed away as you entered into this boiling cauldron of American society, joined together into this common American moral order, this melting pot of America. By the way, the idea of America as a melting pot was first offered in an early 20th century play written by a Jewish playwright. At the same time, in terms of a melting pot perspective on American religion, we see the first uses of the phrase Judeo-Christian values. Now, that's a common phrase we may hear today by some Christian nationalists to express what they hold as the religious underpinnings of American civil society, our Judeo-Christian values. The phrase created a framework for the greater acceptance of Jews, Catholics, and Protestants, forming the religious backbone of America's civil values. That framework, however, left little room to recognize the contributions of other faith traditions, from Buddhists to Hindus to Native American traditions to Muslims. On the American landscape, mosques may be the most tangible expressions of Muslim presence in America, may, for some Americans, represent a tangible expression of that perceived foreignness of Islam. In 2011, the Islamic Society of North America undertook an effort to tally the number of mosques in the United States. At the time, their effort reported 2,300 mosques, or transliterated from Arabic, masjids. This was most likely an undercounting, as the large number of apartments, converted houses, and other hard-to-count structures serve as mosques across the United States. Of the mosques the survey did tally, 76% were built since 1980, and most notably, of those 2,300 mosques, that number experienced a 74% growth between 2000 and 2011, the decade that included these terrorist attacks of September 11, 2001. While Muslims have been part of the North American landscape before the United States was founded, the earliest surviving mosque is in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, the Mother Mosque of America, built in 1934, pictured here. Mosques, like the Muslim population in the United States, cluster in areas with large populations, often major metropolitan areas. For instance, If we look at the list on the left of states with the largest number of mosques, we see New York, California, Texas, Florida, Illinois, and much of that tally relies on large metropolitan areas. If we look at the greater New York City area in 2011, we have 192 mosques. California's 246 mosques is dominated by Southern California's 120 mosques. Illinois' 109, dominated by greater Chicagoland area's 90 mosques, and so on and so forth. But there is a little more to the geography of American mosques than simply major urban areas. So we can see here, now this is a choropleth map of the United States. A choropleth map divides an area by units and then color codes those units to represent the density of some measured variable. In this case, this choropleth map is of the United States at the county level, while states are indicated by bold lines. Each county is color-coded on a scale you can see on the bottom right by the percentage of their population identified as Muslim in a 2010 study of religious congregations and membership in the United States. Notice that the scale ranges from less than 0.1% of a county's population as Muslims to 5% or more of a county's population as Muslims. Also notice that gray is the indicator on the scale for no Muslim presence. And so when we say that many Americans can look at Islam and look at Muslims and see the faith tradition as foreign to them, as strange or unknown, that's a lot of America based on how many counties on this map are gray. If you notice where the counties are colored to indicate Muslim presence, what is going on here? Here's a county in New Mexico color-coded orange to represent 1% to 4.99% of the population as Muslims. What is this? What's going on here? Come on, think Breaking Bad fans. It's Albuquerque. Why would Albuquerque have so many Muslims? The University of Albuquerque. Hold on. So if we go up here to Wyoming, we see where the University of Wyoming is in Laramie, and suddenly we see a 0.5 to 0.99% of the population Muslim. Colleges and universities. So that's what we see in the distribution of the Muslim population in the United States. We see these concentrations over here in California. We see these concentrations in cities in Texas, in Florida, in Atlanta, Georgia. And then we see these college towns like Knoxville, Tennessee. And here we are in the area around Charlottesville at the University of Virginia. And then we again see that dense concentration running between Philadelphia and New York City, and again over in Boston. So that's our geography of Muslims in the United States. But let's take a look at mosques in the United States. Generally, mosques in the United States come in three different categories. Most common in urban areas are storefront mosques, and then another common mosque form across the country are repurposed buildings used as a mosque. Most limited in number are purpose-built mosques, mosques that were designed and built to be a mosque. Take a look very briefly at each category. As I said, the storefront mosque is the most common mosque in the United States, most often in urban areas. It's affordable, it is leased space, sometimes even leased from a building owner who is him or herself a Muslim. But there are challenges to these kinds of spaces. In Islam, Muslims must pray towards Mecca. And so if you are in, such as in this bottom left photo, a storefront that is oriented to the street grid of New York City or Boston or Philadelphia, and your walls don't face Mecca, then you're in an awkward position of having to pray in rows, shoulder to shoulder, facing the corner of the room. And certainly these small storefront spaces, while affordable, also present capacity challenges, especially during holidays such as Eid. And that's not to even address the issue of where can women in gender-segregated worship within such a small space. Repurposed mosques are often a second step in a process of the growth and financial success of a Muslim community. If we want to look at it this way, storefront mosques or mosques in someone's apartment or in an old house are the most affordable starter mosques for a Muslim community. Once the community can fundraise and the community starts growing in numbers, then looking at purchasing an already existing freestanding building to renovate as a mosque is the next step up. However, while these spaces provide Muslims with more space for worship, for fellowship activities, for classroom space, there are remodeling costs, there are compromises that a repurposed building may not face Mecca, may not have rooms large enough for all of the community's needs in the long term, but they are certainly a step up from a storefront space. The final form that we are seeing increasing numbers across the United States is the turn from mosque as a place of worship to mosque as a place of worship and community center. This means that Muslim communities that have grown to sizable numbers and have the financial resources to do so will seek to build a purpose-built mosque to meet not only their worship needs, but also to do things like double as a school, offer after-school programs, recreation and fitness facilities, funeral services, a cemetery on the grounds near the mosque itself, adult education and community outreach. For some mosques, on the top left, for instance, is the plan drawing of the proposed Muslim Society of Memphis, Tennessee. You can see a main building surrounded by a parking lot that serves as not only the worship hall, but also fellowship space. And beyond that, an elementary school and a middle school with recreational and fitness facilities and a cemetery on the grounds. There is a very distinct parallel in this type of mosque as community center as we've seen in large evangelical megachurches, creating campus-like environments for their worship community. For a number of Americans, mosques, whether a storefront mosque, perhaps overflowing on Eid with worshipers on the sidewalk, a repurposed mosque, once a church or a local store or a fire station converted into a mosque, or a purpose-built mosque complete with minarets and a grand central dome, makes mosques tangible reminders of the presence of Muslims in the United States, and since 9/11 has made mosques geographic focus points for expressions of nativism, xenophobia, and Islamophobia. Soon after 9/11, mosques became the targets of physical violence, from fire bombings to vandalism to threats of bombings and vandalism. Hate crimes against Muslims as reported to the FBI by all 49 states that report hate crimes. Mississippi doesn't, by the way. There's no such thing, apparently, as hate crimes in Mississippi. Spiked, particularly in 2001, with almost 500 reports filed by local and state police. But since 2001, every year, 100 to 150 hate crimes have been registered with the FBI targeting Muslims. Mind you, every year there are twice as many, if not 3 times as many hate crimes reported to the FBI targeting Jews. So however much Islamophobic Americans may be, we are apparently even more so anti-Semitic. Oh, and before we leave this slide, one of the most outrageous attempts at physical violence against Muslims was a plot by 3 men to attack with guns and bombs a Muslim community in upstate New York. But physical violence has not been the only form of Islamophobia. Generally, these organized efforts fall into overlapping categories of anti-Sharia measures passed by state legislators and mosque protests against local Muslim communities. In Islam, Sharia is a religious law. It is a set of rules for religious practice, for prayer, for what you can eat, compiled by Muslim scholars for centuries. Much as Jews have rules governing dietary practices and the ritual life of their communities, so do Muslims. But something in the post-9/11 landscape of America, particularly among conservative and white evangelicals, has made Sharia a menacing term. Organizations running from Act for America to Jihad Watch to the American Freedom Defense Initiative to the Organization to Stop the Islamization of America have put forward Sharia law as a threat against American values. But here's the thing. According to a 2016 report from the Council on American Islamic Relations, private capital and foundations have invested over $205 million since 9/11 into the support of these organizations that speak under the mantle of patriotism and defending traditional American values, but whose agenda items consist almost entirely of attacks on the civil liberties of Muslims in America. These organizations, such as Act for America, represent part of a global, not just an American, but a global white nationalist network, working closely with groups in Canada and across Europe. They disseminate their ideas through websites and social media, podcasts, guest appearances on conservative television news networks, books, newsletters, and conferences. Before 2016, the extent of their influence was mostly on the grassroots level of conservative American politics. However, since 2016, individuals tied to these organizations have found a welcome home in some of the highest echelons of power in the United States. For instance, back in October, Act for America announced that it would have its annual gala at Mar-a-Lago, President Trump's South Florida golf club. However, to be fair to President Trump, the Trump organization canceled that event, not wanting Act for America to be perceived as being so closely tied to the Trump administration. On the other hand, former members of the Trump administration, including the gentleman with the mustache at the bottom, John Bolton, have been regular speakers at conferences organized by Act for America or AFDI. Beyond well-funded anti-Muslim organizations, state legislatures had, since 9/11, introduced legislation to specifically ban Sharia law from consideration in the American court system. Now, this is kind of an odd situation because the United States Constitution itself prohibits the reliance on foreign laws in American court cases. And in fact, there have only been a handful of cases where a Muslim defendant in a U.S. court argued on their behalf, basing their argument on Sharia law. And certainly, even in those cases, the rulings passed down by American judges did not predicate their rulings based on Sharia law. Nevertheless, state legislators from Alabama to Kentucky to Texas to West Virginia to Wyoming, and even to North Carolina, which in 2013 tried to combine a conservative culture war dream bill where a bill was introduced in the state legislature targeting Sharia law and abortion. Ooh, a 2-for-1. But regardless, legislature after legislature have introduced and passed bills banning Sharia law from having a precedential, as in established precedent or legal precedent, in the American court system. Were not uncommon, but relatively infrequent before 2001. For instance, in the 10 years between 1991 and 2001, there were instances of protests related to local issues, traffic and noise. The number of arsons and vandalisms at mosques were far outpaced by the numbers of arsons and vandalisms at churches. However, there were spikes in crimes committed against mosques. During the Gulf War, the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center, the 1998 al-Qaeda-linked bombings in embassies in East Africa. However, between 2005 and 2019, there were at least 350 incidences of arson or vandalism at mosques across the United States. If we look at this state-level chloropleth map of incidences of arson or vandalism at mosques in the United States between 2005 and 2019, as provided by the American Civil Liberties Union, we can see that the incidences in Florida, in Texas, in California, in Washington State, Michigan, Ohio, Virginia, New Jersey, and New York You'll note this tracks relatively close with the states with the largest numbers of mosques in the United States. However, on this map, states indicated in red with 5 to 10 incidences of arson or vandalism include states with relatively small numbers of mosques: Tennessee, Kentucky, Minnesota, Wisconsin, Nebraska, Arizona, Oklahoma. So these incidences of arson and vandalism at mosques cover the country. Regardless of how visible Muslims are on the landscape, mosques have remained a tangible target for expressions of Islamophobia. Over the last 5 or 6 years, mosque protests have become increasingly frequent, and the protesters have become increasingly militarized, drawing in white nationalist groups, separatist groups, and paramilitary or militia organizations. As seen here on the bottom left photo of a protest at a mosque in Irving, Texas in 2015, and here on the right at a mosque in Phoenix, Arizona, also in 2015. Of note, these protests were held on Fridays, where men, women, and children attending mosque had to walk past heavily armed G.I. Joe cosplayers. And in a particularly unusual situation in May of 2016, a protest at an Islamic center in Houston, Texas, was organized via a Facebook group called Heart of Texas, calling on true patriotic Americans to come out and protest the Islamization of America, urging them to also demonstrate their Second Amendment rights. At the same time, another Facebook group called United Muslims of America urged people to come out to protest the protest, to stand up in solidarity for American values and interfaith and intercultural understanding. Unbeknownst to either the real Americans showing up to protest the Islamization of Texas, and unbeknownst to the folks of Texas coming out to support their Muslim neighbors, both Facebook groups were fronts for Russian intelligence operations. What could go wrong? Get a bunch of angry Texans with their guns to show up at a protest and then have a bunch of other people angry at them for protesting? What could go wrong in America? Yeah. The last part of this presentation, I want to look at two very different communities. For the last part of this presentation, I want to look at controversies around the construction of mosques in two very different communities, Knoxville, Tennessee, and New York City. Over in Knoxville, the Anur Mosque, for the Muslim community of Knoxville, has stood in the Fort Sanders neighborhood near the University of Tennessee for decades. The mosque itself is viewed here on the right from a satellite view. You could see the mosque sitting at the corner of 13th Street and Grand Avenues in Fort Sanders. Now, the mosque property line runs to about here and then comes back in this direction. You can see my mouse cursor moving around here, along World's Fair Park Drive. Right here is the property line of an abandoned commercial building, which was last the site of an MAB Paints store. So one day in 2009, the local Muslim community learned that the building that used to be an abandoned MAB Paints store was purchased, and someone was planning to renovate it and reopen the building as a restaurant. Okay, no big thing, no problem. However, as the work on the MAB Paints building progressed and the restaurateur applied to the Knox County Alcoholic Beverage Commission, that filing suggested that rather than a restaurant, the owner was seeking to open a bar. Now, there's a problem here. Since the 1940s, Tennessee has had a law that prohibits opening a bar, a porn shop, or any business, quote unquote, that would interfere with public health, safety, and morals within a certain distance of a school or a church or, quote unquote, other places of public gatherings. Now, keep in mind that word church, because for years, most folks have assumed that that meant house of worship. So not just a church, but a synagogue or a mosque or a temple, any house of worship. So when the Muslim community in Knoxville learned that their neighbor, in less than 2,000 feet of their mosque, was planning to open a bar, it seemed almost a non sequitur, an obvious fact. This application to open a bar next to a mosque would be denied. However, it seemed to be that the Knox County Alcoholic Beverage Board was moving ahead towards granting approval for this bar. So they protested and said, wait a minute, we have civil rights that are guaranteed that we do not have to have a business that is quote unquote immoral per state law selling beer and alcohol right next to our mosque. What's going on here? Well, the news of the Muslim community's protest against the Knox County Alcoholic Beverage Commission seemingly violating state law, made it into those webs of information that the organized anti-Muslim groups in the United States operate. One of those outlets is run by a guy named Robert Spencer, and his outlet is a website called Jihad Watch, which basically recounts stories about Muslims in the United States and casts those communities in ways that make whatever they're doing seem nefarious, seem like a threat to their neighborhoods or to American values, while at the same time hawking Robert Spencer's books about the threat of Islam and any of the conference events that Spencer regularly attends or his appearances on conservative television news networks. So, lo and behold, March 26, 2009, Jihad Watch runs an article, Knoxville, Mosque demands that nearby restaurant not sell alcohol. First sentence of the article, stealth jihad in Knoxville. Mosque attempts to impose Islamic restrictions on alcohol upon non-Muslims. So here it is, Muslims in Knoxville on their stealth jihad to have the local beverage commission abide by state law. Okay. So within a week of that story hitting Jihad Watch, the Knoxville Mosque was inundated with threats, profanity-laced phone calls, and in one instance, the gentleman here in the front is Brother Nadeem Siddiqui of the Shura Council, or the Board of Trustees of the mosque, as pictured here on the front page of the Knoxville News Sentinel. The day after someone came by the mosque, placed a Quran in front of this door to the mosque, which, by the way, happens to be the women's entrance. The men's entrance is over here on the left. Poured lighter fluid or gasoline on it and lit it on fire. And after a moment decided that that was not a sufficient message to these stealth jihadis of the Muslim community of Knoxville, and pulled out a handgun, fired several shots into the Quran and several shots into the door. Following this bias incident, there were two outcomes. One, just some advice for y'all. If you are going to threaten to commit arson or vandalism against the mosque, and you leave a drunken, rambling phone call on the mosque's voicemail, don't do so from your own cell phone. But the other outcome was more troubling for civil rights. And that's back here. If you look back at that satellite image that I included showing the mosque, this is from just last year. If you look over here, the Hill Bar and Grill sports bar. Yes, it was approved. And it wasn't a restaurant, and the title of the very business, the Hill Bar and Grill. How did it get approved? How could that happen in such clear violation of state law? Well, it depends apparently on how you read state law. Because as it was defended when it was raised with local state legislators, church in that law from 1947 means churches, not mosques, not synagogues, not temples, not ashrams, but churches. The letter of the law was followed, but probably not the spirit. Well, the controversy that engulfed the Knoxville Mosque in 2009 made local news and made it onto the pages of Jihad Watch. That controversy was nothing in terms of scale and national public awareness, as was a controversy surrounding the construction of an Islamic community center in Manhattan. News of a new Islamic center in Lower Manhattan broke in March of 2010, with the first article appearing in the New York Times' New York Region section. Well, the New York Times is available across the country. The New York/region section is a much more local portion of the paper. You can get it if you pick up a New York Times in New York City, North Jersey, or Western Connecticut. The article was very much a local booster piece promoting the plans for a Muslim community center on Park Place in Lower Manhattan in a building abandoned since 2001 and had last housed a Burlington coat factory. Plans had received tentative approval from the zoning board, and local politicians supported the planned Islamic Center as a marker of urban renewal and revitalization in an otherwise relatively seedy section of Manhattan. If you've ever been to Manhattan and have gone to the World Trade Center Ground Zero Memorial Site, and if you've ever wandered off from there thinking, hey, I'll just take a casual walk from here over to Wall Street, you've probably ended up in some fairly sketchy stretches of Manhattan. And so this was seen as a way of revitalizing an economically depressed area of the city. Another month or so passes until we see another report about the planned Islamic Center, but this time in the USA Today newspaper. You know, the newspaper Americans have shoved under their door back when we could go to hotel rooms. Yes, the USA Today ran an article. But the article itself was a bit different than the tone of the initial New York Times piece. This article framed the project by noting it was in a building that was damaged by debris from one of the hijacked jets that smashed into one of the World Trade Center towers on September 11th, 2001. Author of the article was also apparently not aware of the difference in the planned building as a community center and its variety of functions, and instead described the building's plan as a 13-story mosque, and proceeded in the great tradition of American Journalism 101 to provide a both sides of the story approach. One, that the building would be a way to bridge the cultural divide among Muslims and others in America, and an opportunity to serve a burgeoning peaceful religious population, while others, quote, see a painful reminder of the religious extremism that killed their loved ones. So, the story of the controversy of the mosque begins by the framing of USA Today. Then the story gets a little bit weird, because local New York media doesn't pick up the story until May 10th, 2010, in a teaser piece at the bottom of an article in the New York Post. And if any of you all have ever been to New York City or read local news in New York City, the Post it's kind of a combination of news and gossip. It's as if the National Enquirer focused on New York City and hired a few more political reporters and sports reporters. But for one columnist at the time in the Post, Andrea Pacer, who wrote a gossip column, the mosque was on her radar. And so at the bottom of a column that published on May 10th, titled Cats Out of the Bag for Cougars, she included a blurb that said, "Mosque a mistake. A 15-story, notice it's grown in size from the USA Today article, a 15-story mosque and cultural center is planned a stone's throw from ground zero. Many who lost loved ones on 9/11 can't forget that thousands were murdered there in the name of Islam. There are better places to put a mosque." Keep that last sentence in mind. There are better places to put a mosque. We'll see that again and again. So, on May 13th, Pacer followed up to that blurb with a full column about the mosque. She interviews a number of local opponents to the mosque, including Paul Sipos, then a member of Community Board 1. Imagine New York politics. You have the mayor's office, you have the city council, and then you have the boroughs. And within each borough, there are community boards. So she found a very low-level politician to talk about his disdain for a mosque being built near the site of Ground Zero. Throughout the column, Pacer describes the mosque as, quote-unquote, a monster mosque. She berates the community board that had, back in March, seen the Islamic Community Center plan as a marker of economic revitalization for their quote-unquote stupidity, and goes on to quote Sipos saying, quote, "If the Japanese decided to open a cultural center across from Pearl Harbor, that would be insensitive. If the Germans opened a Bach choral society across from Auschwitz, that would be an insensitive setting. I have absolutely nothing against Islam. I just think, why here?" Again, there's that same phrase. Why this location? So 5 days later, one of those organized anti-Muslim groups in the United States, this one run by a woman named Pamela Geller, the Organization to Stop the Islamization of America, a group that later developed strong ties with a group in Europe called the Organization to Stop the Islamization of Europe, organized a protest at Ground Zero on May 29th to gather people in opposition to the construction of the mosque. The day before that protest, the news of the mosque first appears on national TV on Fox News, with an interview by then Fox News host Greta Van Susteren with New York Congressman Peter King. I want you to listen to a couple of things in this video clip from Fox News about the mosque.
All right, another very hot topic is the fact that some people want to build this mosque now right at the same site as where the World Trade Center towers fell down. So many people outraged by this. They say it's a slap in the face. Where do you come in on this?
Before we hear from Representative King, I want to point out a couple of things about Greta Van Susteren's opening that shifted the geography, the spatiality of this Islamic Community Center. The center, still under construction, by the way, so spoiler alert, is located about 2.5 blocks northeast of Liberty Street, which marks the northern boundary of the World Trade Center site. She says this mosque will be built right at the site of where the Twin Towers fell down. So there's this spatial compression in her setup question for Representative King.
Yeah, I believe it is very offensive and it's wrong. I don't believe that legally it can be stopped, however, because of the First Amendment. But having said that, the mosque will be there. It will be within walking distance of where so many Americans were killed by radical Muslims. And obviously we cannot blame all of Islam for what a handful of terrorists did.
So Representative King correctly notes that the Muslim community has a constitutional right to build a site for their worship, has a freedom of assembly to gather for worship. The argument he makes that this location is inappropriate. We've seen that already in the presentation, and we'll keep seeing that. The mosque makes national news headlines, becomes a frequent topic on Fox News. Between May 13, 2010 and August 12, 2010, guests appearing on the Fox News channel to discuss the Islamic Center opposed the construction of the center by a 3-to-1 margin. And even those who appeared on the channel to defend the mosque did not sound too different from Peter King's claims for the civil rights protections of a religious community to build a house of worship. Yes, they can build the house of worship, but this isn't the place I would have built a house of worship if I were them. Now, if the Park 51 Islamic Center became Fox News's go-to topic for much of the summer of 2010, there was one host on Fox News who, if the Park 51 Community Center was a horse, this host would have whipped, beat, and driven mangled remains of that horse deep into the ground with his shovel. And that was Sean Hannity. On Sean Hannity's show, the mosque came up as a topic again and again and again and again, all through that summer, until being suddenly and mysteriously dropped right around the middle of August. His hosts included folks associated with those anti-Muslim organizations: Bridget Gabriel, Robert Spencer, Pam Geller, Rich Lowry. Of note, one of the guests that was a guy named Jay Sekulow. At the time served as the lead attorney for a legal organization founded by televangelist Pat Robertson called the American Center for Law and Justice. Jay Sekulow argued vociferously against any claims that the Muslims of the Park 51 Community Center had any kind of constitutional or legal standing to build a mosque in that location. Today, Jay Sekulow serves as legal counsel to the President of the United States. Politicians soon weighed in. Sarah Palin tweeted against the mosque, Newt Gingrich giving interviews against the mosque, and possibly in one of the most over-the-top political advertisements aired on New York local cable stations was this. And I will warn you before we start, there are some graphic images included in this video, but I have to just let you see the connections that this political advertisement was making between the Islamic Center and radical Islamic terrorists. And I should note at this point that one of the lead organizers of the Islamic Center was an imam named Faisal Abdul-Rauf. Faisal Abdul-Rauf was a consultant for the State Department during George W. Bush's presidency, worked with the White House and the FBI on community relations between the FBI, the White House, and American Muslim communities. So, in terms of credentials, it is a significant stretch to suggest that Rauf was somehow an Islamic terrorist sympathizer. But here we go.
On September 11th, they declared war against us. And to celebrate that murder of 3,000 Americans, they want to build a monstrous 13-story mosque at Ground Zero. This ground is sacred. Where we weep, they rejoice. That mosque is a monument to their victory and an invitation for more. A mosque at Ground Zero must not stand. The political class says nothing. The politicians are doing nothing to stop it. But we Americans will be heard. Join the fight to kill the Ground Zero Mosque. Go to GOPtrust.com. Paid for by National.
I want to pause it there at that last scene by the National Republican Trust PAC and focus on a couple of things. First, the monstrous Ground Zero 13-story mosque. Notice even the word, the Ground Zero Mosque. To be fair to GOP Trust, the phrase Ground Zero Mosque was first used by a reporter for the Associated Press. And again, using the phrase Ground Zero Mosque infers, as Greta Van Susteren inferred, that this would be built at the site of Ground Zero. Here, the mosque, the Muslim Community Center, becomes a symbol of jihadi victory. And certainly it must be opposed, it must be fought against. We must wage what's the word I'm looking for? I'm not sure what the word I'm looking for is, but in the last scene of this advertisement, there's a girder remaining from the World Trade Center in the shape of is that a T shape? And we're being told we must struggle against the Muslim jihadis. We must launch our own effort to, I almost want to say crusade, but I don't know where I would be inspired to think that. But is it just the media? Is it just a bunch of politicians trying to make hay out of the controversy, trying to score points against a then White House administration they didn't like? Is it just trying to gin up ratings for a conservative news network? And here's the thing. Back in 2010, at the height of this controversy that summer, I was in New York. I was doing research in New York State Historical Society, the New York Public Library, and I was also hanging out and visiting the then under construction World Trade Center memorial site. And I talked to folks. And the thing is, that sentiment of this is inappropriately close to Ground Zero was a common sentiment among New Yorkers. Yes, there were plenty of folks who supported the mosque, who said it's the constitutional right of these Muslims to have a place of worship where they choose to and where they see fit. But there were also quite a few folks who told me, such as Rick, construction worker from the World Trade Center site, the new World Trade Center tower, There's no bleeping way there should be a mosque anywhere in walking distance of the towers. They have the right to their religion, but it's not right to have that mosque here. Barista up in Starbucks, several blocks north, near to Midtown. Not here. I don't care. Build it in Midtown. Build it somewhere else. And also, as a employee of one of the longest standing pizza places in Manhattan told me, and he described himself as pizza slinger when I asked him what his job was, so that's his phrase. The buildings are sacred. It's sacred space. We heard that in that GOP Trust Attack ad. That's sacred space. And there's so much more real estate in this city where you could buy a place. You could put it in Queens and I won't give a shit. So yes, it not only was the media, it was regular New Yorkers. And we can see all across the larger Manhattan landscape, there are mosques in Manhattan, in Brooklyn, in the Bronx, in Queens, across the river in Newark and Jersey City. But this is the site. At least this was the site a few years ago. Building on the right, late 19th century structure with faux Corinthian columns along the first floor, still with the sign that says Burlington Coat Factory over the door. The intention was, and has been, to demolish the structure and rebuild on the spot itself. The initial plans were revealed and then quickly pulled back. And these are those initial plans. You can see the intention was a striking front facade of arabesque design, random geometric patterning that in the evening would be lit up. Probably a little over the top given the controversy that the Islamic Center's construction generated. Those plans, as I understand it, have since been scaled back to something a little less noticeable. It's a view from the inside of the original sketch plans. Again, crisp, modern, futuristic, but very much noticeable. But here's the thing, and this is our last slide. What was lost in the controversy was the degree to which this was a debate, an argument around the place not only of mosques on the American landscape, but the civil rights and place of Muslims in America. And I think it is ironic that somewhat invisible in the controversy was the building's owner. And the way, in this 60 Minutes interview, the building's owner represents that trope of America as a melting pot, of America as a mishmash of cultures and religious traditions that plenty of the people who were angry about the quote-unquote Ground Zero Mosque would certainly claim was one of America's defining features while they were yelling about Muslims and immigrants. But I want to share with you a portion of the interview that 60 Minutes ran that summer of 2010 with the owner of the former Burlington Coat Factory.
A plan to build an Islamic community center near Ground Zero set off a national controversy with anger, passion, and more than a little misinformation. Opponents whipped up a fury, calling the project a grotesque mega-mosque tied to terrorism. Tonight, for the first time, you're going to see the plans for the center, and you'll hear from the key players, including the people behind the mosque. Ironically, the man who has the biggest stake in all of this has been almost completely out of the public eye. He's the developer who owns the project, and he took us to the spot that his critics call an affront to the memory of 9/11. So this is what all the controversy's about.
It is.
This is the focus of outrage. It's a former Burlington Coat Factory store on a dingy block in Lower Manhattan. Real estate developer Sharif El Gamal paid $4.5 million for it.
So you bought this building roughly how long ago? A year ago. A little bit over a year ago, July of 2009.
And before you bought it, what was here?
It was an abandoned piece of real estate.
There was nothing in here.
Nothing. It had been vacant since 9/11.
Vacant because part of the landing gear from one of the hijacked planes crashed through the roof. El Gamal says he will tear this down to create a 16-story Islamic community center. I don't remember seeing this before.
We've never showed it to anyone.
What are
Sure.
some of the things you have here?
A restaurant, childcare facilities, a pool. a media tech library, a world-class auditorium that will seat up to 500 people.
He says membership will be open to all, but around 10% of the space, 2 floors, will be devoted to an Islamic prayer room. El Gamal is a brash 37-year-old Muslim and lifelong New Yorker who develops apartments and offices. He says he got his idea from this neighborhood center where he was a member, the Jewish Community Center. El Gamal thought his project would be a step up for a seedy part of downtown, and the community enthusiastically agreed. The plan was endorsed by the mayor, the borough president, and the community board. But that was last spring. Today, El Gamal is described on the internet as an Islamic supremacist. Who are you?
I'm an American. I'm a New Yorker, born in Methodist Hospital in Brooklyn, to a Polish Catholic mother, to an Egyptian father.
Make sure I have this straight. You're a Muslim who married a Christian girl. Your mother is Catholic, and you joined the Jewish Community Center on the west side of Manhattan.
I did.
If that doesn't say melting pot, if that doesn't say America, I don't know what does. See you next time.